morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Captain Marcus Thompson adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. After 23 years of faithful service to the royal family, he had never felt the weight of his duty more heavily than he did on this crisp autumn day. The golden buttons on his red coat gleamed in the early light, but his weathered face carried the burden of knowledge that would soon change everything. Marcus had served 3 generations of the royal family. He had protected them through state visits, public ceremonies, and private family moments. He knew their habits, their fears, and their deepest secrets. But what he had discovered 3 days ago in the dusty archives of the palace library would test every oath he had ever sworn. The discovery had happened by accident. While searching for historical records about previous security protocols, Marcus had stumbled upon a leather-bound journal hidden behind a row of official documents. The journal belonged to his predecessor, Captain William Hayes, who had served the royal family 40 years earlier. As Marcus read through the yellowed pages by candlelight, his hands began to tremble. The journal revealed a truth so shocking that it threatened to destroy the very foundation of the monarchy. It contained detailed accounts of secret meetings, forged documents, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. According to Captain Hayes's meticulous records, the current king was not the rightful heir to the throne. The real heir had been switched at birth, and the truth had been buried for decades. Marcus spent sleepless nights wrestling with this information. His loyalty to the crown had been absolute, but his conscience demanded justice. He knew that revealing this truth would create chaos throughout the kingdom. Political alliances would crumble, international relations would suffer, and the people's faith in their institutions would be shattered. Yet keeping this secret felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. The weight of decision pressed down on him as he walked through the palace corridors he knew so well. Every portrait of past monarchs seemed to stare at him accusingly. Every servant's greeting felt hollow. The king himself had noticed Marcus's troubled demeanor during their daily security briefings, asking with genuine concern if everything was well with his most trusted guard. On the 3rd night after his discovery, Marcus made his choice. He would approach the king directly and present the evidence. He believed that a man of honor, even when faced with losing his throne, would want to know the truth. Perhaps together they could find a way to handle this revelation that would minimize the damage to the kingdom while ensuring justice was served. The meeting was arranged for the following evening in the king's private study. Marcus prepared carefully, organizing copies of all the relevant documents and rehearsing his words. He knew this conversation would be the most important of his life. As he stood guard during the king's public appearances that day, Marcus noticed how the people looked at their monarch with such trust and admiration. Their faces were filled with hope and respect, unaware that their world might soon be turned upside down. Evening arrived with an unusual stillness in the palace. The king dismissed his other advisors early, sensing the gravity of what his loyal guard captain needed to discuss. As Marcus entered the oak-paneled study, he saw the king sitting behind his massive desk, concern etched across his face. The room was dimly lit by a few strategically placed lamps, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and secrecy. Marcus placed the journal and documents on the desk with steady hands, though his heart raced. He began to speak in a clear, measured voice, explaining how he had found the journal and what it contained. As he presented each piece of evidence, he watched the king's expression change from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror. The king listened in complete silence, occasionally reaching out to examine a document more closely. His face grew paler with each revelation, and Marcus could see the moment when the full implications hit him. This was not just about losing a crown. It was about learning that his entire identity, his life's purpose, and his family's legacy were built on a lie. When Marcus finished his presentation, the study fell into a heavy silence. Outside, the palace continued its evening routines, unaware that history was being rewritten in this quiet room. The king stared at the document spread before him, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the original journal. The leather binding felt cold in his hands, as if it carried the chill of decades-old secrets. The king closed the journal slowly and looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of an hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "Marcus," the king said, his voice cracking slightly. "In all your years of service, have you ever known me to be anything other than honest with my people?" Marcus nodded without hesitation, which seemed to provide the king with some small comfort. "Then you understand why I cannot simply ignore this information, no matter how much easier it would be to burn these documents and pretend this conversation never happened." The king stood up from his desk and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. In the moonlight, Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clasped and unclasped behind his back. This was a man grappling with the complete destruction of everything he had believed about himself and his family. "Do you know what the most painful part of this is, Marcus?" the king asked without turning around. "It's not losing the throne. It's knowing that my father, who I loved and respected above all others, was part of this deception. It's wondering if my mother knew. It's thinking about all the decisions I've made as king, all the lives I've affected, all based on a lie I never knew I was living." Marcus felt his heart break for this man he had served so faithfully. In 23 years, he had seen the king make difficult decisions with wisdom and compassion. He had watched him sacrifice personal happiness for the good of his people time and again. The irony was cruel. The man who might not be the rightful king was perhaps the most worthy person Marcus had ever known to wear the crown. The king turned back to face Marcus, and there was a new resolve in his expression. "We need to find the real heir," he said firmly. "According to this journal, the switch was made at birth and the other child was taken to a family in the countryside. If that person is still alive, they deserve to know the truth, regardless of what it means for me and my family." Marcus had expected this reaction, but hearing it confirmed his deep respect for the king's character. A lesser man might have tried to hide the evidence or eliminate anyone who knew the truth. Instead, this king was choosing the path of honor, even though it would likely cost him everything. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "the journal indicates that the child was taken to the village of Millbrook, about 2 hours north of the capital. The family name was Coleman, but that was nearly 50 years ago. The trail may be very cold by now." The king nodded thoughtfully. "Then we start with what we have and work from there. But Marcus, this must be handled with absolute discretion. If word of this leaks out before we can properly investigate and plan, it could cause panic throughout the kingdom. Can I trust you to help me with this difficult task?" Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked directly into the king's eyes. "Your Majesty, I have served the crown faithfully for over 2 decades, but more than that, I have served a man of integrity and honor. That hasn't changed. Regardless of what these documents reveal about your birth, I will help you find the truth, whatever the consequences may be." Relief flooded the king's features. Having Marcus as an ally in this impossible situation meant everything. Together, they began to plan their next steps. They would need to travel to Millbrook quietly, without drawing attention from the palace staff or the media. They would pose as historians researching local families for a cultural project, which wasn't entirely false given their mission. The king insisted on making the journey himself, despite Marcus's concerns about security and the risks involved. "I cannot ask someone else to potentially destroy their life while I remain safely in the palace," the king explained. "If there is someone out there who is living the life that should have been theirs while I live the life that should have been theirs, the least I can do is look them in the eye when we speak." They agreed to leave in 3 days, giving them time to prepare a cover story and arrange for the king's schedule to be cleared without raising suspicions. Marcus would handle the logistical arrangements while the king prepared mentally for what they might discover. As Marcus prepared to leave the study, the king called out to him one final time. "Marcus, I want you to know that whatever we find in Millbrook, whatever comes of this investigation, you have shown me what true loyalty means tonight. Not blind obedience to a crown or a title, but loyalty to what is right and just. I am honored to have served alongside a man of your character." Marcus bowed deeply, but as he straightened, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The next few days would test them both in ways they could never have imagined, but they would face whatever came together, bound by a shared commitment to truth and justice that transcended royal titles and ceremonial duties. The journey to Millbrook took place on a gray morning when fog hung low over the countryside, providing perfect cover for their unusual mission. Marcus drove the unmarked car while the king sat in the passenger seat, both men dressed in simple civilian clothes. For the first time in decades, the king traveled without his usual security detail, with only Marcus as his protection. The drive passed mostly in contemplative silence, both men lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. The king stared out at the rolling hills and small villages they passed, wondering if somewhere among these humble homes lived the person who should rightfully wear his crown. Marcus kept checking the rearview mirror out of habit, though he knew no one was following them. Millbrook turned out to be a charming village of perhaps 300 people, with a small main street lined with local shops and a church that had stood for over 2 centuries. The buildings were well maintained but showed their age, speaking of a community that valued tradition and took care of its heritage. As they parked near the village center, both men felt the weight of their mission settling heavily upon them. Their first stop was the local parish church, where Marcus hoped the records might provide clues about the Coleman family from 50 years ago. Father Bennett, the elderly priest who had served the community for over 30 years, welcomed them warmly when they explained their supposed research project. "The Colemans, you say?" Father Bennett mused as he led them into a small office filled with carefully preserved records. "Oh yes, I remember them well, though they passed away many years ago now. Thomas and Mary Coleman were good people, very active in the church. They had a son, James, who would be about 50 years old now if my memory serves." The king and Marcus exchanged meaningful glances. The timeline fit perfectly with what they had learned from Captain Hayes's journal. Father Bennett continued, unaware of the significance his words held for his visitors. "James was always a bit different from his parents," the priest recalled with a fond smile. "Thomas and Mary were simple farming folk, hard-working but not particularly educated. But James, even as a boy, had this natural dignity about him, this way of carrying himself that reminded you of someone important. He was bright too, much brighter than anyone expected. The teachers at the local school said he could have gone to university if the family had the means." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Everything they were hearing seemed to support the journal's claims. A farming family with a son who displayed unexpected refinement and intelligence, born at exactly the right time to be the switched royal child. "Is James still in the area?" the king asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. Father Bennett shook his head sadly. "Oh no, James left Millbrook about 25 years ago. After his parents died, he sold the farm and moved away. I heard he went to London, but I'm afraid I don't know exactly where. He never married, poor fellow, though he certainly had opportunities. Several local girls were quite taken with him." The priest paused, seeming to remember something else. "Actually, there might be someone who could help you find him. Sarah Mitchell runs the village post office, and she keeps in touch with quite a few former residents. Her family has lived here for generations, and she has a remarkable memory for people and connections." 20 minutes later, they found themselves in the cozy post office speaking with Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a welcoming manner. When they mentioned James Coleman, her face lit up with recognition and fondness. "James Coleman. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while," she said warmly. "Such a gentleman, that one. Always polite, always well-spoken. He used to help my elderly aunt with her garden when he was just a teenager. Never asked for payment, just did it out of kindness." Sarah confirmed much of what Father Bennett had told them, adding her own observations about James's unusual characteristics. "He had this way about him," she explained, "like he was meant for something bigger than farm life. Don't get me wrong, the Colemans were wonderful people, but James was different. More refined, if you know what I mean." When they asked about his current whereabouts, Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Well, this is rather coincidental that you should ask about him now," she said slowly. "I actually received a letter from James just last month. He's been working as a museum curator in London for the past 15 years. Specializes in historical artifacts and documents, from what I understand." She paused, studying their faces with the shrewd gaze of someone who had lived in a small village long enough to read people well. "He mentioned in his letter that he's been researching his family history lately. Said he found some old documents among his parents' belongings that raised questions about his background. Seemed quite troubled by whatever he'd discovered." The king felt his breath catch in his throat. Could it be that James Coleman had found evidence from his end of the story? Were they about to discover that the man they were seeking was already searching for answers about his own mysterious past? Sarah reached into a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a small address book. "I have his current address right here if that would help with your research," she offered. "He lives in a flat in Bloomsbury near the British Museum where he works. As Marcus carefully wrote down the address, the king struggled to maintain his composure. After 50 years, they had found him. The man who might be the rightful king was living just 2 hours away, working with historical documents, possibly already suspicious about his true identity. The drive back to London was filled with intense discussion about how to approach James Coleman. They couldn't simply knock on his door and announce that he might be the rightful king. Such a revelation required careful planning and sensitivity to the enormous impact it would have on his life. James Coleman stood in his small but tidy Bloomsbury flat, surrounded by boxes of documents and photographs he had inherited from his adoptive parents. For weeks now, he had been trying to make sense of the puzzling items he had found hidden in his mother's bedroom after her death 2 years ago. Among Mary Coleman's personal effects, carefully wrapped in silk and tucked away in a secret compartment of an old jewelry box, were papers that didn't seem to belong to a simple farming family. The documents included a formal birth certificate that listed different parents than Thomas and Mary Coleman, medical records from a prestigious London hospital rather than the local village clinic, and, most mysteriously, a letter written in elegant handwriting that spoke of the great sacrifice made for the good of the kingdom. The letter was unsigned and dated 50 years ago, just days after James's supposed birth. As a museum curator specializing in historical documents, James had the skills to authenticate old papers, and everything he examined appeared genuine. But the implications were so extraordinary that he had spent months trying to find alternative explanations. The documents suggested that he had been adopted as an infant, but why would such formal records exist for a simple farming family's adoption? And why would anyone speak of a sacrifice for the kingdom in connection with his birth? The more James researched, the more questions arose. He had always felt different from his loving adoptive parents, not just in appearance but in instincts and interests that seemed to come from nowhere. While Thomas Coleman struggled to read simple texts, James had taught himself to read classical literature as a child. While Mary Coleman was intimidated by formal social situations, James found himself naturally comfortable in elegant settings. James had also noticed that he bore a striking resemblance to certain historical figures he encountered in his work at the museum. Several visitors had commented on his similarity to portraits of past royal family members, remarks he had initially dismissed as coincidence. But as the pieces of his mysterious past began forming a pattern, he started to wonder if these resemblances might be more than chance. 3 days ago, James had finally gathered the courage to contact a private investigator who specialized in genealogical research. The investigator, Helen Morrison, had agreed to help him trace his biological parents using the documents he had found. She had warned him that the search might reveal information that could dramatically change his understanding of himself and his place in the world. On this particular evening, as rain drummed against his windows, James was carefully cataloging each document when his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting visitors, and given the sensitive nature of his research, he had become more cautious about unexpected callers. When he looked through the peephole, he saw 2 men in their 50s, one of whom seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen him. "Mr. Coleman?" the shorter of the 2 men said when James opened the door with the chain still attached. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and this is my colleague David. We're historians researching family lineages in rural England. We understand you grew up in Millbrook and wondered if we might ask you a few questions about your family history." James felt his heart rate increase. The timing of this visit, coming just as he was investigating his own mysterious background, seemed too coincidental to ignore. But something about the men's manner suggested they were trustworthy, and his curiosity overcame his caution. "Please come in," James said, unchaining the door and stepping aside to let them enter. As the man who had introduced himself as David stepped into the light of his flat, James felt a shock of recognition. This was the face he had been seeing in mirrors his entire life, aged by about 15 years and bearing the weight of authority, but unmistakably similar to his own features. Marcus noticed James's reaction immediately and exchanged a meaningful look with the king, who was struggling to maintain his composure at meeting the man who might be his biological brother or cousin. The resemblance was undeniable and far too strong to be coincidental. "Mr. Coleman," Marcus began carefully, "we should be honest with you about why we're really here. We have reason to believe that the circumstances of your birth may be quite different from what you've been told. In fact, we think you may already be investigating some of these same questions yourself. James's legs felt weak, and he sank into his desk chair, surrounded by the very documents that had been haunting his thoughts for months. "You know about the papers I found?" he asked quietly. The king stepped forward, his royal training in diplomacy warring with his emotional response to meeting this remarkable man. "James, may I call you James? We know this is going to sound incredible, but we have evidence that suggests you may have been switched at birth with another infant. The family you knew as your parents were wonderful people who raised you with love, but they may not have been your biological parents." James stared at them both, his mind racing. "Switched with whom?" he asked, though part of him was already beginning to understand the impossible answer. Marcus pulled out copies of the documents they had found in Captain Hayes's journal, laying them carefully on James's desk next to his own mysterious papers. As James examined them, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. "According to the records we've discovered," the king said gently, "you may be the biological son of the late King Edward and Queen Margaret. If this is true, then you are the rightful heir to the throne of England." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. James looked back and forth between his visitors and the documents spread across his desk, his analytical mind processing the evidence while his heart struggled with the emotional implications. Everything he had wondered about, every question that had plagued him since childhood, suddenly had an answer that was both wonderful and terrifying. The silence in James's flat stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. James sat motionless, staring at the documents that had just rewritten his entire existence. When he finally looked up, tears were streaming down his face, but his expression was one of relief rather than shock. "I've always known something was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not wrong with my parents, they were wonderful, loving people who gave me everything they could. But wrong with me, with my story. I never fit into the life I was living, no matter how hard I tried." The king moved closer, his own eyes bright with emotion. "James, I need you to understand something very important. If what we've discovered is true, then I have been living your life for 50 years while you've been living mine. But in all that time, you've become something I could never be. You've become a man of genuine character, shaped by love and hardship rather than privilege." James wiped his eyes and looked directly at this man who claimed to have been living his rightful life. "And what kind of king have you been?" he asked quietly. Marcus answered before the king could respond. "He has been the most honorable, compassionate, and dedicated ruler this country has seen in generations." When we discovered this truth, his first concern wasn't for his own position, but for finding you and making things right. A lesser man would have burned the evidence. James stood up slowly and walked to his window, looking out at the London streets where he had lived as a commoner for decades. "Do you realize what you're asking me to consider? I'm 50 years old. I know nothing about being a king, about royal protocol, about running a country. I'm a museum curator who lives alone and has never even been in charge of more than a few staff members." The king joined him at the window. "And do you realize what I'm facing? I've been king for 25 years. I have a wife who loves me, children who depend on me, and an entire nation that trusts me, but none of it was ever rightfully mine. Every decision I've made, every ceremony I've presided over, every moment I've worn the crown has been built on a lie I never knew I was living." Both men stood side by side, looking out at the city they might soon need to serve in very different ways. James finally broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. "What do we do now? Even if we can prove this beyond any doubt, revealing the truth could destroy the monarchy itself. People have invested their faith and loyalty in you. Your children are being raised to inherit the throne. The entire system would collapse if this became public." Marcus had been thinking about this exact problem since the night they first discovered the journal. "There might be another way," he said carefully. "What if we approach this not as a replacement but as a restoration? James, you could be quietly integrated into the royal family, perhaps as a long-lost cousin who has been found. You could be trained in royal duties and gradually take on more responsibilities as the king's health requires him to step back." The king looked at Marcus with surprise and gratitude. It was a solution that could preserve the stability of the monarchy while slowly correcting the historical injustice. "It would mean living a careful lie for the good of the kingdom," he said to James. "But it would also mean that eventually, the rightful king would assume his proper role." James turned back to face them both. and they could see that his mind was working through all the implications. You're asking me to give up my quiet private life and enter a world of constant public scrutiny. You're asking me to learn to be something I've never been, to take responsibility for millions of people I've never met. Yes, the king said simply. That's exactly what we're asking. And I understand if you say no. No one could blame you for choosing to keep the life you've built for yourself. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised them both. What kind of king do you think I would be? Based on what you've learned about me, what you've seen tonight, do you believe I could serve the people well? Marcus and the king exchanged glances, and Marcus spoke first. James, in the few hours we've known you, we've seen you respond to life-changing news with grace and thoughtfulness. You've asked about duty before privilege, about service before power. You've shown more natural royal instinct than some people who were born to it. The king nodded in agreement. You've also shown something else that's crucial. You understand what it means to live among the people you would serve. You've worked for your living, faced real challenges, made your own way in the world. That's experience that no amount of royal training can provide. James walked back to his desk and looked down at all the documents that had brought them together. His mysterious inheritance and their shocking discovery. When he looked up again, there was a new resolve in his expression. If we're going to do this, he said firmly, we do it right. I don't want to simply slide into power through deception, even if it's well-intentioned. I want to earn the respect and trust of the people I would serve. I want to be worthy of the crown, not just entitled to it by birth. The king felt a surge of pride and relief. This was exactly the kind of response he had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Then we'll work together, he said, extending his hand to James. You'll learn everything you need to know about being king, and when the time is right, when you're ready and the kingdom is prepared, we'll find a way to make the transition that serves everyone's best interests. As the two men shook hands, Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in history, a peaceful, voluntary transfer of royal power based on truth and honor rather than conquest or death. It would take years to accomplish, and it would require the most careful planning imaginable. But for the first time since discovering the journal, he felt hopeful about the future. 3 years had passed since that remarkable evening in James Coleman's London flat, and the transformation had been extraordinary to witness. What began as an impossible situation had evolved into something beautiful and unprecedented in royal history. The plan they had crafted together worked better than anyone had dared hope. James was introduced to the public as a distant cousin of the royal family, recently discovered through genealogical research. His background as a museum curator and his genuine, thoughtful manner made him immediately popular with both the press and the people. The story they told wasn't entirely false. He was indeed family, just much closer family than anyone knew. Marcus watched with pride as James, now known publicly as Prince James, conducted his first major state ceremony. The man who had once lived quietly among rare books and historical artifacts now moved with natural grace through complex royal protocols. But more importantly, he had brought something fresh and authentic to the monarchy that the people found deeply appealing. The current king, officially still the reigning monarch, had gradually stepped back from public duties. Citing health concerns that were partly real and partly diplomatic fiction, this allowed James to take on increasing responsibilities, while the public grew accustomed to seeing him in positions of authority. The transition was so smooth that many observers commented on how naturally suited he seemed for royal life. Behind the scenes, James had proven to be everything Marcus and the king had hoped for, and more. He approached every lesson about statecraft with the same careful attention he had once given to preserving historical documents. He studied constitutional law with the passion of someone who truly understood its importance. Most remarkably, he brought a common person's perspective to royal duties that made him exceptionally effective at connecting with citizens from all walks of life. The king's family had welcomed James with warmth and curiosity. The queen, initially bewildered by the sudden appearance of this cousin, had grown genuinely fond of him. The royal children, now young adults, found in James an uncle figure who could relate to their struggles with public life in ways their father sometimes couldn't. What could have been a source of division had instead become a source of strength for the entire family. On this particular morning, Marcus stood in the palace garden where James was reading through briefing papers for an upcoming international summit. The sight never failed to amaze him. The boy who had grown up on a farm in Millbrook was now preparing to represent his nation on the world stage, and doing so with remarkable skill and confidence. "You know, Marcus," James said without looking up from his papers, "there are still moments when I wake up and wonder if this is all an elaborate dream. 3 years ago, I was worried about whether I could afford to repair my flat's heating system. Now I'm reviewing trade agreements that will affect millions of people." Marcus smiled at the man who had become like a son to him. "And how do you feel about that transformation?" James set down his papers and looked thoughtfully across the garden. "Grateful," he said simply. "Not just for the opportunity, but for the way it happened. If someone had simply told me at birth that I was destined to be king, I might have grown up feeling entitled to it. Instead, I had 50 years to learn what real life is like for ordinary people. I understand what it means to work for every pound you earn, to worry about the future, to feel powerless in the face of large institutions. And that makes you a better king than someone who never had those experiences?" "I hope so," James replied. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to have your voice dismissed because of your background. I know what it's like to depend on public services, to need help from government programs, to feel like the system doesn't always work for people like me. That perspective is something you can't learn from books or advisors." As they talked, a messenger approached with news that would mark another milestone in their extraordinary journey. The king had made a decision that he had been contemplating for months. He was ready to announce his formal abdication, allowing James to assume the throne with full public ceremony and recognition. "He wants to do it properly," the messenger explained. "A full coronation ceremony, with all the tradition and pageantry that the occasion deserves. He says the people deserve to celebrate their new king openly, and you deserve to begin your reign with the full support and recognition of the nation." James felt his heart race at the news. They had always known this day would come, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. In just a few months, he would go from being Prince James, the discovered cousin, to King James, the sovereign ruler of the nation. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "Are you ready for this?" James stood up slowly, looking out over the palace grounds that would soon be fully his responsibility. "I think I am," he said with quiet confidence. "Not because I was born to it, but because I've spent these 3 years learning to earn it. I've seen what kind of king I want to be, and I've had the best teachers anyone could ask for." The irony was perfect and poetic. The man who had unknowingly lived as a commoner for 50 years had become more prepared to be king than many who were raised for the role. His unusual path to the throne had given him exactly the perspective and character that the monarchy needed in the modern world. As Marcus watched James return to his briefing papers, preparing for the responsibilities that would soon be entirely his own, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. A discovered journal had revealed a historical injustice, but it had also created an opportunity for something unprecedented. A king who truly understood both the privileges and the responsibilities of power. The coronation would be celebrated throughout the kingdom, but Marcus knew that the real crown had already been earned through years of dedication, humility, and service. James Coleman had proven that true royalty comes not from birth but from character, and the kingdom would be better for having a king who understood that truth in the deepest possible way.